circulation was rising, but as a part of the population, it was declining dramatically. And basically, in all developed nations, and in most developing nations, you are getting, yes, rises in circulation, but declining in household penetration. So newspapers in most countries of the world today are found in no more than in about 1 out of 4 houses. And this is very different from situations in the past, and this has altered a lot of the economics of the industry. Now, when we look at what is happening, there are basically 3 important trends that we have to be thinking about. And the first is that just the way the business is organized, the way it is configured, the way it gets its money, all of those kind of characteristics are changing, and I'll talk about those for a few minutes. The second big trend that's going on is that the value of news and information is declining. And we'll talk about why that's happening. And if your value is declining, you've got a problem getting some money for it very quickly. And then in media, and particularly in journalism, there are very bad attitudes about the public. And this is something that has been with us for about 100 years since professionalization of journalism began. And it creates real problems today in the digital world, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is happening. Now, the first challenge, as we said, is that the characteristics of the news business are being altered so dramatically along the way. It used to be that news was a very, very fast-moving consumer good. Lots of people read it, it came, you took it, it was gone, you bought the paper and it was gone. And in making all of this work, you had really inefficient markets economically. News markets all around the world were either oligopolistic or monopolistic situations. Very few people actually ran newspapers, and as a result of that, advertising and stuff went to these few, and it made them very inefficient. They could charge what prices they wanted to. They could do pretty much what they wanted to in business terms. And the result of that is that if you owned a newspaper in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, this was a cash-producing organization, lots of free cash. And in business terms, if you have an industry that produces lots of cash, it becomes very attractive to lots of investors. And in fact, we saw large companies start moving in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to buy up newspapers and news organizations. Before that time, they had been operated primarily as cultural organizations, as political activities. They had been operated by families that had some relationship to the community and were trying to do something with it. But when things became very wealthy, they sold out, and they took the money and left. And went and did other places in many countries of the world. And even when they didn't sell completely, they would sell part of the company and put it on the share market, for instance, to do that, because the high cash flows were very attractive to investors. If you looked at newspapers 25 years ago, and you looked at their financial statements, they had very heavy assets. And by heavy assets, we mean when you look at an organization and you say, where is the wealth invested in the organization? They invested it in land, in buildings, and other such things because they needed printing presses. Printing presses, I can't translate it quickly into reals, but $200 million. Then you have to put a building around it, so maybe that's another $100 million. Then you have to have all these trucks that you have to invest in. There's huge assets that are on your balance sheets. If you look at digital companies, they have almost no assets at all. They're just nothing is holding them in that term along the way. And newspapers and magazines, because of all of these factors, had very good profits. They made a lot of money, the money came, and by the 1980s, 1990s, in Europe and North America, newspapers were producing between 20 and 35% returns every year on sales. That means for every dollar that somebody gave them for buying a newspaper, they kept between 20 and 30% as profit. Now, the average company produces about a 4% return on sales. So, when you compare the newspapers to the average, it's 8 to 10 times better than better than banks, better than drug companies. All these organizations that we hate because they're, oh my God, they're only concerned about money. Newspapers and news organizations were doing that in that period. And it was a marvelous thing for them and their investors. Now, the problem was all that money coming in, which was coming in primarily because of advertising, and essentially between 1950 and 2000, in North America and Europe, the amount of money from advertising tripled in real terms, adjusted for inflation. So it was 3 times as much money in 2000 than in 1950. It was a great place to be. And publishers and others were not paying attention. And if you look at the research that a number of us were doing back in the 70s and 80s, we're saying there's a real underlying problem here. This can't go on very long, because while there was growing consumption of circulation, the penetration rates were going down. Advertisers need to reach large amounts of the population, and less and less of the population was being reached. And so, in a lot of the research that I did in the 1990s, and Leo Bogart, the advertising group, we were telling the newspaper associations all over the world, this is going to come to an end. You're in deep, deep trouble. You can't do this and think it. But every year was better financially, so they just felt, great, we just keep spending money. You had very high prices for advertising, and this was the formula in the newspaper business. You keep the circulation price low, so you get a lot of people reading, and then you put all the costs over on the advertisers. And the advertisers didn't have a lot of places to go, so they would pay the price for doing that. Because you had so much cash coming through the organizations, you didn't have to go out and take on debt. So when you needed a new printing press, you could pay cash. Or if you needed to pay for it on debt financing, you got very good terms because you had lots of cash laying around. This is a great business to be in along the way. So they didn't have much in the way of debt. They had all of these things in cash, and the investors are looking at those balance sheets and going, companies awash with cash, with great assets, buildings, lands, property. We want to invest in them very heavily, and we want to get those 20 and 30% returns. And that, up until the late 20th century, was the situation for newspapers. Now, it led to some very risky behavior in the late 1990s and early part of the millennium. And that was, up until that point, whenever they wanted to buy radio stations, television stations, invest in some other media, they would swap shares. They would just do it with shares. All of a sudden, they started taking on debt financing to do it, and began doing that in a great way. The first crisis that affected them was the recession, in the worldwide recession in 2001 to 2003, where you had a great drop in advertising, and a number of companies got in trouble because of the debt financing. The second recession, in 2008 and 2009, literally killed many companies, that they could not pay their debt. They couldn't make 25% profit returns, which they had calculated to pay their debt. They were only making 13% profit returns. Well, all these other companies are going 13%. We would love to have 13% because they're making 3 and 4% return. But the newspapers had so not paid attention to their debts that when this dropped, they were caught, and many of them were hurt very, very badly along the way. Now, what things are changing from this is dramatic. Instead of being a widely used consumer good, where 40–50% of the people read you, suddenly newspapers and news magazines are becoming very niche projects that only some people read. And that's a big change in business terms, in terms of how you think about the business, how you think about what your audience is, and how it's configured. Instead of the inefficient markets, because of the monopolies, suddenly the markets have gone more efficient, because advertisers now have a lot of places they can go to advertise, many of which are even free or much cheaper than the newspaper. Many of reach audiences better. And so suddenly we now have this huge amount of competition coming in for advertising and for the attention of people who need news and information. Because you can get information on television, on cable, on your smartphone, on your tablet. You can get it in many, many different places today. So suddenly the markets have been disciplined by competition. Now, from an economic standpoint, that's a great thing. That suddenly now they can no longer abuse the advertisers and take high profits out of the industry. The high cash flow they used to have is now really low, and they're not getting much money. And you see this particularly in the digital world, where the amount of money being made in the digital world for the same services or same things being sold is about 1/10 of what they got in the old print world. The assets that they used to have, they're now getting asset light. And if you look all around the world right now, many big publishers are selling these really big, nice publishing houses that they built in the center of towns. The New York Times has sold it. The Chicago Tribune has sold it. A number in Europe have just sold theirs. They're getting out of these because they can't have those kind of assets and liabilities on a balance sheet and be very flexible as a company. And so they're changing their balance sheets. Instead of the excess profits, they're now getting normal profits. And normal profits, the term normal profit actually is accounted for in economics. It's the kind of profits that you would normally see that would be in the range of expected incomes for risks taken along the way. So we're now getting to the normal levels of profits along the way. And what is driving these changes are the audiences and the advertisers are not consuming anymore. Their prices for audiences to read newspapers are going up. The general prices around the world have gone up about 50% in the last 10 years. It's rising, and so we're making it more expensive for people to get. They're having to pay not only in print, but now they're paying for their tablet apps and everything else to get the news along the way. We're now seeing it's getting harder for them to self-finance their operations because they're not producing the cash that they used to along the loan. They now have low debt loads because they have to. They dare not have them along the way. And they're not an attractive investment. So the investors are selling out newspapers. And other kinds of owners are starting to come in. So when we look at the problems that are facing the industry, there's not an easy way to take care of this. This is a long-term change that's been going on. The elements have been growing for about 50 years along the way. And what we're seeing is just a complete transformation of the news industry and how news is produced and distributed in society. And that has a lot of very important implications for society that we can talk about in our discussions. Then there is the problem I mentioned of the declining value of news and information. Now, that does sound, you say, how can that be that news and information isn't valuable? And it happens for some very specific reasons. Journalists, and some of you are journalists, or some of you love journalism, I'm sure, have a very great idea. They actually aspire to do wonderful things. And they think they do those things. They think they're holding power to account. that they're investigating the bad things that go on in society, that they're protecting the public. And they have all these noble aspirations that they like to say what journalism is doing. And sometimes they do those things. I don't diminish that at least. I'm at the Reuters Institute. I can't diminish that in the least. But when you actually look what they're doing, they're very rarely doing those things. They're trying to figure out, is our football star going to be up to be able to play in the next match, or has he got physical problems? They're looking at what's happened to the latest celebrities. They're just, it's a lot of information that's not really all that important along the way. There's also a problem in that journalists have tended, simply because of the nature of the business, to cover institutions. So you cover the mayor's office, you cover the parliament, you cover the school board. You don't talk about what's going on in the schools, you talk about the school board. Well, the parents care about what's happening to their kids in the school, but they don't get that news. It's not there. So different kinds of news is covered simply because journalism tends to be institutionally centric, because we have beats in the way that we cover different topics along the way. So there's a gap between the ideals that journalism say, this is what we're doing to serve functions in society, and often what they're doing on a day-to-day basis in terms of handling those kind of issues along the way. 50 years ago, if you wanted to know anything in town, anything that was going on around the world, you read the newspaper. I saw a wonderful photograph this weekend of Times Square in New York when they were putting out an extra in 1922, and the square is filled with people rushing down to get the latest edition of the newspaper, because it was really important to be able to get that. You had to go through the newspaper. Anything that you wanted about what was going on in town, you went and you got that. Today, that's all available elsewhere. If you want to know about the sports team, you got it watching it last night. You certainly have got it on your mobile device. You've got it in all these other places. You don't have to read the newspaper to do that. If you're going to find out if the government is going to raise taxes, you don't have to read the newspaper to do that, because the government's own websites will tell you they're going to do that now. If you want to know what people are saying about some debate in public affairs, it's on all the blogs you read. It's not just coming from the newspaper. And so there's this transformation of where and how information is reaching people in society, that even when the newspaper is doing the good thing, it's someplace else as well. And so newspapers are faced with this crisis. If they keep expecting to do the same things here that they've already done, it's becoming less and less valuable, because you're not going to pay as much for it if it's free someplace else. And we know it's free. It's on the side of buildings. It's in buses and trucks. It's in metros. It's everywhere we go now. There's news and information about general things that are happening. So we can't just cover news in the same ways and expect that it's going to work. And this is the problem for the value. And so we've got more information today than ever before from more sources that are there. A lot of them are free sources, and a lot of the free sources are very good. We have free newspapers, we have free online news, we've got lots of places where news is coming that's very good. And so what we see happening, though, is that in this rush to produce all this news, it tends to be event-oriented news, bits and pieces, small bit, very little analysis, very little understanding of what's behind it, very little of trying to deal with things. We've just completed a massive study with 10 partners across Europe, looking at how the Euro crisis was covered in different countries across Europe. It's content analysis, 10,000 articles in 11 languages, really a big project. The one thing that came out, only 1% of the articles were analysis and background. Only 1%. A huge crisis, not only economic crisis, but political crisis for Europe, and only 1% of the articles all across Europe are saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to understand what's going on here. And this is the problem that's happening because we're not spending the time to do that kind along the way. We're also getting expert journalism today in a way that we didn't get before. If I wanted to understand what was happening in biotechnology and what was happening in genetic research that is now coming very close to being able to change people's genes to stop things like Down syndrome and AIDS and other things, I would send a journalist out. They'd go interview some doctors, some scientists, some others, and write the article. Today, those same scientists are writing on their own blogs for the public. Here's something that's happening. That didn't happen before, but the journalists had the access to them before, so they could monetize that. Today, they're going around. We have it happening in finance, we have it happening in sports, we have it happening in all kinds of stuff that we're getting these very, very specialized and niche forms of journalism, many of them with people that are far more expert than any journalist ever was in doing it. All of this is de-skilling and devaluing the work of journalists, and that becomes real problematic along the way. So we're sitting in a situation where now the audience has more news and information than it ever had, and they're spending more and more of their time trying not to get news and information. And we've got more and more blockers for information, more and more people wanting to have just specialized information that they want, and others because they can't cope with the amount of information. Information and data is growing at a rate of about 35% a year. Okay? I mean, it boggles the mind. You can't begin to handle it all. And we are in huge problems as individuals dealing with it, much less a society as a whole. And what is happening at the same time is now these audiences are leaving the newspapers. They're leaving the news magazines. They're leaving the big television newscasts and going elsewhere and saying, I'm happy with the little bit I get elsewhere, and that's enough. Now, that's a huge problem for society because it means then that we are less educated or we're happy having only a little bit of information that might come through social media or other media to reach us along the way. It also means then that interpersonal influences and other such things become much more influential in terms of social debates, policy, and other such things, which create some very interesting political dynamic issues for anybody interested in those kind of things along the way. Now, if we look at the legacy news organizations, they've always had a few purposes. They wanted to help the public participate in society. And that's a great idea, help the public participate in society. It worked better when you had 50 to 60% of society watching, listening to the news than it does now along the way. But there was also a real purpose for most of these organizations in that they were commercial. And when they were commercial, what they had to do was attract audience so they could get the advertisers who would finance it. And so when you actually look at the content of most newspapers, even quality newspapers, you actually find that only about 20% of the content is news. And the rest of it is entertainment, sports, columns of various kinds, things that have nothing to do with this function of helping the public participate in the debates of society. So there is a fundamental problem here along the way. And so the strategy of trying to fill up newspapers with all of this other material to attract people who didn't care about the news part isn't working because they're gone. They've left. And the ones that are there still want the news part, but they're not getting very much. So it's not very valuable to them. And what they're getting is often syndicated news, news from wire services, other such things, rather than original news or good background coverage along the way. So that creates a huge problem for it. In the end, it essentially means that news organizations have to really rethink what they're doing. You have to go back to say, what is this product that we're delivering in newspaper? What is the product we're delivering in the web? What is the product we're delivering on the smartphone or the tablet? They have to really understand what is there. People are using all of these. It's rare now that people use one form. people use 3 or 4 forms to access their news. And they do it for different reasons at different part of the day, and they use different information in those different parts of the day. And this is one of the things that good newspapers that are tracking their users are beginning to understand of when they use or want certain kinds of information in the day. But you have to be able to do that, or you're in real trouble along the way. The other thing that you have to do is that because print and broadcast were one-way communications, typical mass communication to an abstract audience had a lot of different interests, you didn't know who they were. Well, suddenly now, because of the digital age and because it's two-way communications, and you're getting information back on who they are, because the audience wants to react to the information, wants to participate in it in different ways, sometimes by commenting, some by adding to it. You have a different dynamic going on, and we have trouble dealing with that in media, and particularly news media, because we've always held them at arm's length, and now they're trying to interact with us, and that creates huge problems. So we really have to think about who these readers are, what roles we play in their lives, what they have to contribute to us, all of these kind of things, and what we as a news organization are going to do that's better and different from what all the other news organizations do. Because if you can't say, we do this, and have a profile that's different from the others, well, they might as well go to anybody. And that's the problem for competition in a very highly competitive environment along the way. Now, underlying all of this, it's these, what I argue are really unhealthy attitudes about audiences. This is a picture of the archway at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Okay? It was the first school of journalism in the world, 1908 started. And over it, if you can read it, it says, journalists are the schoolmaster of the people. Okay? We're going to tell you what you need to know. We're going to educate you to think right. We're going to do... This is an incredibly paternalistic approach to thinking about the audience, that you have to be educated to think correctly, that you have to be disciplined in the way you get our information and take it, and we're going to have you locked in and sit there in the class and lecture to you. Okay? You know, you've got to educate that, right? We've got to take care of the people. We've got to stop social disorder and the rabble that's out there from getting out of hand. My God, they might go into the streets and be unhappy if we don't do this right along the way. And then you put that on top of the professional norms of journalism, which say distrust everybody, don't get too involved in things in society or others, or you'll have opinions, and that may color your ability to do journalism. All of these professional values and paternalistic roles come together to create, we don't like our audience very well. And so now in the new digital age, that becomes a real problem. Because in the digital age, we're really networked with our users in a very different kind of way. The whole system of online work and online participation with your audiences and your customers is very collaborative today. And that doesn't work well with those basic kind of values that have been under, because we don't have acceptance, we don't have trust, we don't have all of these basic underlying ideals, because we have this paternalistic role and this step away from me, keep away from me kind of role. And that creates problems in the world. And you really see it when you actually look at the digital world. I mean, in the material world, we had very structured relationships with people. In the digital world, it's very amorphous. Okay? And you suddenly know that your social networks are getting bigger, and you've got people from 2 or 3 continents, and some of them you know really well, some of them less so, but you're all very amorphous relationships of community being developed in the digital world. In the material world, privacy was a very big part of this, and there were certain things you didn't let out. Revelation and transparency are very, very high in the digital world. the idea of property versus the idea of sharing, the idea of hierarchy versus collaboration. All of these kind of things are very different, and newspapers are firmly stuck in this other. We got our intellectual property rights. We want to control what information is on our websites. We want to control the comments that people make. All of these things are still stuck in this other approach that is less and less viable in the digital world. So we're in a situation today where the news business is transforming. It's not just changing, it's transforming dramatically. The companies will never be what they were in the 1980s and 1990s. And they're trying to find their new ways to work in this world. And it's very difficult transformation, because it's not just a transformation of money, but about some of the underlying norms and values of the way that they relate to audiences, the way they configure their businesses, and the value of the product and the content that they're actually giving to people. So I'll stop there with that, and we can talk about those issues. You can tell me I'm crazy. You can tell me I'm wrong. You can tell me, oh, we don't see that in Brazil. And then we'll talk about that. Or you can ask any questions you want about this or about other things since I'm here. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think I got what you defined by legacy news.
Okay, yeah. Legacy, these are the established media. This would be print newspapers, the news magazines, television broadcast news, things of that sort. That's the legacy media, the ones that have been there, for the established media, if you will. And now they're being challenged by all kinds of news providers in digital form. They're being challenged by aggregators and search engines and others that are distributing, and by all kinds of new services that are distributing across digital platforms. So that's the difference between the newer born digital, if you will, and those that have their foot in a legacy of very traditional media.
Do you associate necessarily with the medium itself, like the sport, or with the nature of the institution? For example, an alternative print newspaper would fit into legacy, or?
It depends on when it was started and the attitudes that come under it. It's not the medium itself. It's the institutional structures, norms, and other such things that guide it. And the big media that we have traditionally known are these really big established legacy organizations. But when Metro came in 1995 and said, wait a minute, we can do news and give it away free to people, they were not thinking like a legacy news organization in their life. They do totally different, breaking all the rules, starting all over again, because they weren't having to protect an established institutionalized media company at that point. Yeah.
In the last 20 years, the media didn't necessarily very much. And the last weeks, how do you perceive the accusation from Jeff Bezos
Yeah, there were the two big sales, of course, that have occurred in the last couple of weeks in North America were Bezos taking on the Washington Post and John Henry buying the Boston Globe. Two billionaires coming in and buying them. They are interesting in that neither Bezos nor Henry had previously been socially or politically active, that they had not. They aren't linked to any particular political ideologies, and so why are they stepping into this? And I think there's several reasons. One, I think they think they can actually do something to help the papers. Secondly, rich people have to have their toys too. Okay, right? Very often they buy football teams, sports teams. Well, John Henry bought Liverpool. He bought the Red Sox along the way, and now he's buying the Boston Globe. That's interesting. He made his money in investments and in turnaround of companies that were in trouble. He knows something about management, but nobody really knows what he's going to do with it. the one thing that everybody's happy with, and Boston, the one thing about Boston, the favorite pastime in Boston is hating anything that has to do with New York. So having the New York Times own the Boston Globe was perceived very badly in Boston. So he's bought a lot of hometown happiness that he's brought it back to the hometown. But there is this point, and certainly in you see it a lot in North America, you do see it in Europe as well, that there's a point that when people are very, very successful as businessmen, they also want to be respected as citizens. And you don't become respected as citizen just for making money. You have to do something that's socially viable and useful. So I think that that's part of what they've done. Now, Bezos is a little differently for a couple of reasons, one of which Bezos bought the paper with a personal check for $250 million. He took out his checkbook and wrote $250 million. I mean, that's nice. So, I mean, it wasn't corporate, it wasn't financed, it's just cash out of my checkbook. What's really worried to me is he actually has $250 million in his checking account, but that's another issue altogether. But Bezos basically took the mail order business. This is what Amazon is the mail order business. And it was done with catalogs and done offline. And he looked at that and said, how can I put that in a digital form? How can I streamline that, add value to it, change the operations, and make it do things in an interesting way? And I think what he's doing, looking at the Washington Post, is saying, what can I do to change those all back operations, the underlying business operations, because that's where he made his money, is understanding how to deal with those distributional problems, the other thing. It also makes sense because he has Kindle and Kindle Fire and these tablet devices, and start thinking about how he might be able to use them that way. So I think it's a toy. I think he thinks he's going to do something. I mean, the $250 million is less than 1% of his wealth, so this is hardly risky to him along the way. And and he could have spent it in a lot worse ways, and he could have come to Rio and bought a football team, I suppose. So something's changing there. There have been sales of many other papers to other people now that have gone out of the corporations, both in Europe and in North America. The one noted most is Warren Buffett, who has bought. But Warren Buffett is not buying big papers. He's buying small papers that are undervalued and actually producing very good returns, these 13 and 20% returns. And he's buying them with cash and no net debt on them. And he's basically saying, if I can keep them alive for 15, 20 years, I'll more than recoup my investment. So it's not, he's doing it strictly as an investment, which is a very different kind. So we're seeing new kinds of owners come in. So it is very different. We're seeing a lot of new kinds of startups some are being started by community activist groups, some are being started by foundations, some are being started by journalist collaboratives of various kinds. These are very interesting. We don't know if those are going to work, because most of them are now only about 2 to 3 years old, and it takes 3 to 5 years to see if they can actually survive. But some of them are starting to work. Mediapart in Paris, for instance. Mediapart in Paris has operating on a budget of €7 million a year. Last year it made a 10% return. And that's all digital, just people paying for digital subscriptions. We see that happening in different places. Some are large, some are small, and we're watching them carefully to see if they're sustainable. We don't know yet. Yeah, question.
I have two comments. I think the first one is really only a comment about specifically the situation that seems to be interesting to look at the perspective of the framework. That is, and both comments have to do with big corporations. And one is the phenomenon that you review maybe I think we only where we have algorithms. And maybe it's just because they still don't have the talent. So to fit your, I think that would fit your idea that they're going to, this phenomenon is going to finish as soon as everybody has their data. That's only a comment question. Second thing is, listening to you, it seems that you're always referring to a symbol profile of a user. And I'm very convinced that actually you understand better the internet. You think of different profiles of users. And the big news corporations, they have this capacity of adapting to new markets and new media. And what we're seeing in Brazil is that big news corporations, that they're really good at it. Actually, they are offering the internet something that's very important for most users, that some guy inside that access information that you were describing so well. If we are here lost in this universe of all the information that is possible, we need some guys. And journalists, they are consuming this role. For example, the news portals that belong to the corporation, and then they are a very solid guide for whoever is not there. Because I don't think that every user wants to comment or wants to participate or wants to become part of the issue. Maybe they just still want to be informed, rely on being informed by someone that they can delegate this to. And I think these corporations are doing this very well, and that's one place for journalism.
Well, it depends on where you are. I mean, I do take your point that not everybody wants to participate all the time along the way, and that's absolutely true. And we know from a lot of the studies that are being done on the internet that there are people that never participate, there are people that participate a lot, and most people participate now and then. And so there are differences in people. The one thing about the internet that's different from the offline media is you can actually get an idea of who's doing what and what kind of people are interested in what things and other such things. Media are doing a terrible job at that at the moment. They don't know how to deal with the big data that's coming in. And in fact, there's several big projects being done now by World Association of Newspapers, by the News Editors Network, in order to try to figure out how do you've got the ability to capture all this data, but trying to figure out what it means and what you should do with it is the next step. And nobody's doing that very well as of yet. You're right that a lot of big media companies are throwing a lot of money into trying new things on new platforms and other such things, and I think that's great. I mean, I'm kind of platform agnostic. One of the things about platforms is that if you look at consumer electronics, very, very few consumer electronics get above 40% household penetration. Okay? And I'm also a real skeptic about the wired world syndrome and everybody's going to be connected and other such things. When half of the world's population is living under 50 cents a day, they're not going to go out and buy a $100 tablet or even a $50 tablet. And when a third of the world's population doesn't have electricity, you've got another problem on top of there. So, we're dealing with really underlying things that when people say you're going to link everybody. But in nations where, and one of the reasons that the print media and other media are booming in Brazil, they're also doing it in India and in Malaysia and in China, is because the economies have been improving. You're building basically middle classes. Middle classes have money to spend. Advertisers want to talk to people who have money to spend. So they are going and saying, we want these there. Now, the newspapers are going to keep running those, and the digital people will keep running those for as long as the advertisers want to keep spending for that group. The minute the advertisers say we can reach them directly now, and this is the problem of North America and Europe right now, is that once Volvo has figured out that you're interested in a Volvo, they no longer have to advertise to you. They go directly to you with emails and other such things. And show you how powerful this is. I'm watching television with my wife one night. We're watching a movie, and an ad for BMW comes on. And it was for the 5 Series BMW, which I happen to think is a fairly nice car. I have a difficult wife. She makes more money than I do, so very difficult. Yeah, so I have to be really nice, because she's she's with me because she likes me, not out of obligation, right? Little problems that occur in modern marriages. But I'm watching it, and my wife is kind of she's never interested in automobiles at all. She goes, "That's a really nice looking car," and my heart's going boom, 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 BMW. This is great. But she stops the program, the ad stream, and clicks on the ad and goes to the website. And it's got the website there. Now that ad probably cost them 2-3 pennies to get her attention. She goes to the website and she can play with it. She changes the color. Oh, how about black interior? It's doing these different things. That probably cost them maybe $5 in engagement costs to be able to have that system up to do. The next day, in the post, she gets a personally printed digital brochure with the car that she was playing with the colors and other such things, all there to her, telling her the price and giving her the name of the person who will bring her the car to have her test drive it. Yeah, and that's the thing. Once they start connecting with you, they don't need advertising anymore. They need marketing, and it's much more personalized. And that's what's happening with all of them. Still haven't gotten the BMW yet. Damn. But I did get a message from my Volkswagen dealer a week ago telling me my Volkswagen needs to come in for service. That's once they've got you linked in the digital world and know who you are, it's much cheaper for them to actually spend a lot of money dealing with you as a customer than trying to get you to be a customer. And this is the problem with advertising, that advertising all over is declining once you've got customers. And it's a really interesting problem with the modern world. It's not that there isn't marketing, it's just different forms, and it's not media advertising, because they will leave it as soon as they can. And that's where you have problems then for those media who are absolutely set on it. Now, you're right when you say, the other thing you said was that people who are not interested in hard news and are interested in the other things, yeah, they can get them in a lot of different ways, and they're now getting them in free newspapers. They're now getting them in newspapers that they pay very little for, just pocket change, and other such things, and they're getting it free online and on their smartphones and other such things. So they've got a lot of places to do it. So why then are traditional media still trying to chase them if they're using them in the, that's my point, because it's not being very good for the traditional media, because now they're upsetting their hardcore, because you have heavy readers and light readers of news, okay? And they're chasing the light readers and upsetting the heavy readers because they're doing away with the things that was there. There was a wonderful study done by the Pew Center in the U.S. this last year that showed that 1/3 of newspaper readers in America say the quality's declined and their newspapers aren't providing them the news and analysis that they want. Now, if that's your hardcore reader saying that, they're going to start leaving you, and those are the ones you really need to keep. So there are problems. So we have to be watching the product very carefully if we're doing it from a business. Yeah.
So, first thing, I was surprised with one of your declarations. It has to do with the findings of the Euro crisis reporting, the lack of analysis that goes against the usual trends, and one of the criticisms of nowadays journalism. We say that it's lighter, no substance at all, and you're changing analysis for hard news. No hard news anymore, only analysis. So I don't know if you have any position on that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point for heavy analysis, for people doing heavy analysis, but the public is wanting more analysis. That doesn't mean they want all analysis, but if they're getting 1 or 2% analysis out of a large number of stories, that's probably not enough, because all of those reports of what out of the 10,000 reports, I think about 6,000 of them were market reactions to whatever the latest pronouncement was. Well, if you're really interested in market reactions, you're getting them live on your stream, on your computer, or on your smartphone. So just having all those little tiny stories in the back is not going to be very useful for you. And I think that's the problem that we're getting into, is that newspapers can never keep up with the flow of events very well because they're technologically not adept to do so. So if they can't keep up with just saying, here's the newest thing that's happened, they have to say, here's what it means. Here's where it's going. Here's what's going to happen next, or what you need to look out for next. And that means that newspapers are actually going to become maybe more hybrid to magazines, as we've known them in the past.
And the second thing has to do with this relationship with the audiences. They're not so much engaged in interacting and networking. Why do you think is that? They are afraid that they are losing the power to settle the news or determine the content? Do you think it's a matter that has to do with not having enough means to deal with this in a professional way, to answer all the interactions? What's your take?
I think it's a little bit of all. Certainly because they've been reducing staffs and other such things, it becomes a burden because there's more things that they have to do. But I think also, as I said, I think a lot of it just has to do with the professional norms, that we're the specialist, we create the news, and you take it. And I think it's just an attitudinal thing as well. So it's a lot of factors coming in together, I think, at the same time.
I think I have two questions now, sorry. I'm very interested in that. That's why I keep thinking of questions. One of them has to do exactly with this share of analysis versus news in the content. Just like you said, actually, as Professor Novais said before, we are having less and less news in the newspaper, but not only in the newspaper, in every other media. I already worked in broadcasting, in print media, in radio, and everywhere I'm told that, but readers don't want news, they want analysis, they want comment, they want opinion, they want infotainment. And so it's not up for papers to break the news. But on TV, they also said, it's not up for TV to break the news, it's not up for magazines to break the news. So who is breaking news anymore? So you being from Reuters Institute, I would ask you if you think that only news agencies are supposed to break news in the current trend or in the near future. The second thing has to do with these both successful and unsuccessful experiences, both in print and online. And I got two examples from each. I remember I was in London. They launched the London paper, which was a free newspaper, also like Metro, which just like those that Professor Ode mentioned, was supposed to be a commuting paper for people to read while commuting. And it lasted for like a couple of years and disappeared. Also the same that Professor Novais mentioned, the Daily. It was that joint venture by Apple and Murdoch. It also closed its doors like in a matter of months. But on the other hand, you have things like Huffington Post and Politico that seem to be very successful in doing quite very, very similar strategies. So what's the difference between success and failure in this one?
Well, there are a number of factors that go into it. I mean, the London papers, for instance, they got 6 free papers for commuters anyhow, so you got lots of choices there. So it just obviously didn't interest people enough. But there's a difference between things like the Daily and the London paper, and that is that those are organized paid things that are actually paying staff members to do it. And what we're seeing with a lot of the online digital stuff, they're using effective labor. They are not paying most of the staffs, or when they are paying them, they're paying them pennies a word, or pennies an article, or pennies a hit. And it's a very, very different environment. In fact, the way their payments look like the way newspapers back in the 1880s and 90s used to pay, a penny a word. You're not on a contract. You're not an employed journalist with them. Everybody's an independent contractor. And so essentially they're cutting out all the costs along the way. Well, what is this going to do to the profession of journalism? What does this do to the ethics of journalism when you don't have a newsroom where the institutional ethics work out along the way because everybody is, whoever they are, and for whatever reason, writing where they are and not having a debate with others in the newsroom? There's a lot of real issues to those changes. But the big difference is they don't have the overhead costs. They're not having paid writers for the most part, and they're just liking people who are doing it for some other reason, hoping to maybe get a paid position along the way. It's not a good situation right now. Digital journalism is a minefield right now on paying journalists. It's really terrible. So. News agencies, yeah. I am not speaking for Reuters. I am not employed by Reuters. I do take their money. I also take money from a dozen other sources as well. But the news agencies are an interesting problem because news agencies can never cover local news. Okay, news agencies are very good for doing national, regional, international news along the way. And so they tend to do a certain type of breaking news and other such things. They're doing some analysis pieces and others. The problem is that you're a news agency and you write a story that 23 people died in a car bombing in Kabul yesterday. Okay? That gets picked up by 10,000 news organizations around the world. How valuable is that story? First of all, it can be available everywhere, so why are you paying that news organization to get it as a customer? The second point is, what does it matter that 24 people died in a car bombing in Kabul yesterday? 100,000 people have died in Kabul since the war started. What we need is discussion of why is NATO still there? What do they think they're actually doing? Those are the issues, not these little flow of events news. And that's the problem for a lot of news agencies. They have to do the flow of events news along the way. But now their customers are finding it more and more difficult to monetize it. So it is a problem. So we may move to a situation down the line where flow of events news is covered by news agencies and nobody else. I just don't know. But it's a problem. But the business formula for news agencies is really in trouble because the business formula for news agencies are all these legacy media paying them, supporting them for their services. Well, what if you start losing legacy media, and you're seeing that happen already? What does it mean? In some countries now, they're losing their national news agencies because they can't afford to keep them, because they just don't have enough money to keep them going. That's a really interesting problem, because then how does that nation talk to itself in different regions of its own, and how does that nation then get understanding of what's going on abroad as it relates to that country and not necessarily to the country of where the news service is from? And that becomes a huge problem. And so we're going to have to look at the financing of news agencies. It's a huge problem. Reuters is fine. Reuters is with Thomson. There's lots of money. Associated Press, they're fine. FA is fine. But you start getting to the smaller agencies and you start finding real problems for them. I suspect that we're going to start a move back toward state-sponsored national news agencies, which is a good way for bringing money in. The question is, how do you keep the government in power at a particular time from saying, oh, that's my news agency? And that's, it's a problem we've had before, and we'll have it again. So. Well, it's been a pleasure. So I can't believe that's the only questions you have about the future of the media world.
Back into the BMW example, something something similar happened to me. I just moved to a new apartment and I was looking for new furniture at some websites, and the stores put the advertisement in my Facebook timeline or in the page, and some other sites that I search was appear in my Google search, and very scary it is. But I think this is a new model of advertisement. So how can the traditional media survive to this new model if it's cheaper to do that than to publicize the product or the service at the traditional media?
Well, that is the essential problem, is it's not only cheaper to do it that way, it's more effective to do it that way. And those two things are a killer for the traditional media. The traditional media are now reacting, and the way they're doing it primarily is they're raising the price to the reader. And that's not unusual. I mean, if you go back to 1875, 1880s, and you bring the prices forward to today, that was in the days before you had advertising of any significance in the newspaper. If you were paying for that same newspaper in London today, you paid a penny for it then. Today you would pay £3 to £4 for that same paper. Okay? And that's, if you lose advertising, you've got to charge the reader. If you're going to charge the reader, you'd better make sure the reader's really happy with the content they're getting. And that's the problem. As this model starts changing, you have to be very, very careful about making sure you're serving the reader in a very strong way. And so that's the only way they're going to survive that way. Other things they're doing is they're looking for new kinds of revenues. Essentially, 25 years ago, if you looked at a newspaper, there were two sources of revenue. You had advertising, which, depending on what country you were in, was between 60 and 80% of the income, and you had the rest coming from circulation, maybe 1 to 2% from other things. In most big newspapers today, in North America and Europe, advertising is about 40 to 50% of the income. Circulation's about 25% of the income, and the rest is coming from digital sales, from events, from e-commerce, from all kinds of other things that they're doing, and they're doing many, many more things to survive. Now, subscription or single copy, because in some countries it's primarily single copy. But it's from the sales of the circulation. So you're now seeing a much more widened, and people are going, oh, this is so awful, that we have to do this. This is what newspapers did 100 years ago. Most of them ran bookshops. Some of them ran branches of bourses so people could trade stocks. There were lots of things that newspapers did. Many of them had outside enterprises that had nothing to do with communications or other things that were supporting them. In Nevada, in the United States, in the 1890s, there were 7 newspapers that were run by bordellos. You got to get some money. Not only are you getting money, it's a good place for information. So very strange. The world will find strange ways to do it. But essentially now people are going to look for lots of different ways. Some companies are running digital advertising agencies to help, and doing the whole online packets for them. Some are running websites for people. I mean, we're going to see more and more different kinds of revenue streams rather than just the ad circulation. That was the artifact of the structural arrangements of 20th century mass media. And the 20th century mass media is disappearing. So now other kinds of structural arrangements will have to come into place. Whether that's good for society or not, nobody knows. But at the very least, it will break down some of the power arrangements that existed previously, but it will replace them with new ones. And the question is, are those new power arrangements better for the public or not? We don't know. That's the exciting thing about life. That gives you things to watch all your careers. So.
Okay. I think we have come to an end. We want to thank Robert, and the best way to do it is to ask you to join me in a round of applause to our guest. E agora a nossa mestre de cerimônias dá os próximos passos.